This is Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 1 of 10-Minute Atari Retro Cast. Now, we all know there was a fierce rivalry back in the 80s between Atari ST and Atari 8-bits and the Commodore 64 and the Commodore Amigas. Just like there was a rivalry between the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum over in Europe. Now, we all know that Commodore won before the competitors even managed to get out the gate, but I'm not here to talk about Commodores, the Amigas, or anything associated with them today. Excuse me one second. Yeah, today is all about the Atari ST. In episode 1, we're going to cover a bit of the history of the Atari ST. We're going to dig into some of the hardware on it and some of the solutions for getting it to work with modern hardware. And then next episode, we're going to dig pretty heavily into the features, capabilities, and what's available on the Atari ST. Now, Atari has been in the computer industry for a really long time. In the late 70s, they came out with the Atari 400 and the Atari 800, which were actually fantastic machines, and they actually beat Commodore to market on these machines by several years. By the time 1985 rolled around, they'd started to lose some of their steam and some of their popularity, and software manufacturers just weren't writing that much for the Atari 8-bits anymore. Now, when I was just getting into the computer industry back in 1982, when I was 12 years old and looking at what I was going to buy, I was looking at the Commodore VIC-20, which was around $100 to $150 at the time, and I was also looking at some of the Ataris. Now, I didn't really want the Atari 400 because it had that cheap little membrane keyboard, and the Atari 800 was like $600 or $700. So, you know, the price just pushed it over the edge, and that's what got me to go with Commodore. Now, in 1985, something really, really strange happened. Jack Tramiel, who was the owner and founder of Commodore, and was the guy who pushed the PET computers, the VIC-20s, and the Commodore 64s out the door, he got booted out of Commodore by the board of directors. So, Jack decided to have a little bit of revenge by going out and buying the then floundering Atari company for a song. And he was going to try to beat Commodore at their own game. Poor Jack, he couldn't cut a break. He received a double slap in the face after being booted by Commodore by, soon after buying Atari, having the Amiga pulled out from under him. See, Atari had made a deal with the old Amiga Corporation before Commodore had them for rights to some of their hardware designs. And right before everything was about to go down, Commodore came in, wiped out the debt that Amiga owed to Atari, and got the rights for themselves. Jack was not happy. So, being doubly motivated to not only thumb his nose at his old company Commodore, but possibly do something with another finger too, Jack decided to come out with a 16-bit computer that would not only compete with the Macintosh of the day, but with this new Commodore Amiga that had been pulled right out from under him. So he asked his designers, which actually were quite a few Commodore engineers from back in the day that he stole from Commodore, to bring out a 16-bit computer to rival the new computers coming out in the future. So in a few short months, the Atari ST was born. Now, it was tested and brought to market really, really quickly, which surprised a lot of people. Much of the design was done by Shiraz Shivji, who played a major role in the design of the Commodore 64. So there was still some Commodore 64 DNA going into the Atari ST. The Atari 520 ST was released in April of 1985, and then it started shipping in quantities a couple of months later. It beat the Amiga 1000 to market by a couple months though. It also came in at about 2/3 the price of a Commodore Amiga 1000. You could get it for about $800 with a monochrome monitor and about $1,000 with a color monitor, which was a pretty good deal at the time, considering the Macintosh was out there at like $2,500. Now, their first machine had 512 kilobytes of RAM. It did not have a floppy drive. That was an external unit only, which was kind of different. The floppy drive itself was 400 kilobytes, single-sided, 3.5 inch. But considering that's also what the Macintosh had, it really wasn't that bad. And speaking of Mac, it was $2,500. It had a ugly little monochrome 9-inch display, and it had 128 kilobytes of RAM and a 400K floppy. It really made the Atari ST look like a fantastic system in comparison, considering it was in full color for much less than half the price. This is not about the Amiga 1000, Doug. Don't say a word. No comparisons, you promised. Now, not long after the 520 came out, within a year or so, they came out with the Atari 1040ST. This included a built-in floppy, which was a major seller for it. It included a built-in power supply, which brought the weight of the unit up and the size of it up, but it was very convenient and much fewer cables coming out the back. And it had 1 megabyte of memory on board for less than $1,000. And Atari was the very first company to ever ship a 1 megabyte computer for less than $1,000. Those were soon followed up by M versions of both the Atari 520 ST M and the 1040 M, which added an RF modulator, which was really important to have. If not, you had to use basically an Atari monitor to get a display out of them. A little later on, they came out with a Mega ST, which was a nice kind of a desktop case. Slightly reminds me of another slim desktop case computer. The name is just slipping my mind. And then in 1989, they came out with the STE line of computers, both a 520 and a 1040. Now these added cool things like this newfangled thing called a blitter. Get this. These STEs had a 4096 color palette as opposed to the 512 color palette the old STs had. They also had a much, much higher quality stereo sound chip in them. You know, that sounds kind of familiar. Why does that sound so familiar to me? Who knows? No idea. Now, the real last hurrah of the Atari line, there were some others in between there, we'll talk about another time. The real last hurrah was the Atari Falcon, which came out in 1992. Now, the less said about that sad, sad piece of technology, the Atari Falcon, the better. So I'll tell you what, if any of my people watching the show have one, do yourself a favor. Just send it to me. Just send that Falcon to me. I'll dispose of it properly. Trust me. Now, Atari finally got out of the computer industry in 1993 to concentrate on the Atari Jaguar, which unfortunately wasn't a success either, although it was a really cool console. The Atari Falcon was sold off to another company that sold it for a couple of years as a musical tool, and then the whole Atari line just kind of faded into oblivion. But now on to what we're here to look at today, my Atari ST. Now, I had an Atari ST already back in about 2014 and 2015. I picked it up from a local guy in Tucson along with several Amigas. It was an ST-M, so I could hook it up to the television, but the ROMs were all in Swedish, so I never used it. I goofed around with it for like an hour or two, then I sold it on eBay for $100, $200. When I got back into the Amiga community full-time in 2018, I did have regrets about selling my ST. I was curious about their capabilities. Then last month, I found an auction for a 520 ST, but realized it had no floppy drive, and those were hard to find. So I passed on the 520 and instead bought a tested 1040 ST from the Brewing Academy. My new Atari came in within a few days, but I had no way to display it. Now, back in the day, your display choices were pretty much Atari monitors, unless you had an M version that had the modulator. There are more options now, including hooking them up to a 15 kilohertz VGA monitor and even to 31 kilohertz monitors in monochrome mode. So I sent some feelers out in the community, and the translation is, I asked my friend Peter Fletcher, or Rec2Pete on Twitter. He is probably one of the smartest Atari guys in all of North America, and he recommended I get an Atari 13-pin cable to a SCART connector and then use my SCART to HDMI connector that I used for my Amigas to get a display out. It sounded like a great idea. So I got this in, hooked it up. The display was totally unusable. The screen was so distorted I could barely even see what was going on, and it was not coming out with any colors whatsoever. So I checked all the pins, all the pinouts were correct, everything was fine. I did some research and I discovered that some early Atari 1040STs did not have a C-Sync signal on one of the pins if it was not the M version. The C-Sync just wasn't needed unless you had a modulator built in, so they literally just don't have the little resistors installed on the motherboard to supply the C-Sync signal, which was why the SCART cable was not working. There's a hardware fix for that, and I probably will get to it and do it one of these days. But I went back to my friend Pete, told him about it, and he came to my rescue again. So Pete sent me an Atari ST to 9-pin RGB cable. He said he had successfully used these not only on Atari monitors, but on the Commodore 1084S, which I own. I also own a Commodore 1902. Now, my 1084S is a PAL version, and for whatever reason, it does not have a 9-pin connector on it. So I thought, we'll hook it up to my Commodore 1902. Nope, signals were totally wrong. I could not get a video signal out of it at all. But I started thinking, it's still sending the RGB signals down this connector. They're still really honestly and truly there. So was there something I could do to get this to work? Yep. Enter the franken-display. This is a 9-pin serial type breakout box, which basically means you can put a male or female 9-pin connector on here, and it passes the signal to these little breakouts right here. So I plugged in the monitor connector and I tested each individual pin to see which one was red, green, blue, which one was the horizontal sync, which was the vertical sync. Then I tied into those specific connectors and ran them directly to my GBS 8200. Now you guys may know I did a video on this, a couple videos on this actually. It's a mediocre quality upscaler that allows you to take a lot of RGB signals in various ways and display them on modern monitors. Hooked this up to this little connector right here, and I was able to get a signal out of it immediately. Now I will be the first to admit that while the franken-display is not the most beautiful solution, and the display is off to the right a little bit, and it's chopping off a few pixels over here that I cannot adjust on the GBS 8220. The pictures there is rock solid. I'm able to load games, I'm able to load programs, and all the modes except for the highest resolution mode work just fine. So I'm pretty pleased with this solution until I get my Atari to VGA cable in a couple of days. Now let's go over the 1084 ST itself. What's that doing there? Get out of the way. Did you guys see that? You can get those on teespring.com/10mark. The keyboard looks great, but the keys are a bit mushy to type on. Certainly not bad, but they're just quite mushy. The distinct function keys are actually really cool. I like the little angles here, and the cooling fins on the top are a neat little effect. This is a very meaty and weighty piece of equipment. It's got some serious heft to it. Let's take a closer look at some of the other components on this this machine. The built-in power supply certainly adds heft to it, but it's also a very thick and meaty case. Okay, Every single Atari ST video that I've ever watched whines and complains about the location of the mouse and keyboard ports. And they're absolutely right. They're awkward to get to. If you need to pull out your mouse and put in another joystick, they're just a pain to actually even get in there and get loose. It's just inconvenient, and I can imagine they sold a lot of the extension cables. Over on the right here, we have a 720 kilobyte 3.5-inch floppy drive, double-sided, double density. The original 520 came with a 360 kilobyte floppy, single-sided, and from what I understand, some of the 1040s, the earliest 1040s, also had the single-sided floppy. It is not uncommon that games and things were sold on a single-sided floppy in order to fit and work on the original 520s. The other cool thing is these discs are in basically something very similar to MS-DOS format, FAT16, so it's very easy to interchange data with a PC using these floppy disks, especially with later versions of the operating systems. On the back here, we have standard 25-pin serial and 25-pin parallel ports, which worked with several modems and several printers of the day. Atari actually made some really nice laser printers that were used in desktop publishing. This port is a bit of genius. This is the ASIC port, ASIC. It's a predecessor to SCSI, and it's actually a hard disk controller port built into each and every one of the Atari ST computers. Now, being a predecessor to SCSI, it didn't use the same drives, and it had limits on the capacity, it had limits on the number of partitions, but the fact that it shipped with a hard drive controller was pretty cool. Now, I cannot find that many references for hard drives that were available back in the day. There are some, but not truckloads. But today, there's something called the Satan disk, which is a rather interesting name, which is an SD solution that plugs right back into here. There's one that just plugs right on and sticks up, and then there's an external box. I'll go over that more in my review video. Next, we have the floppy disk connector, which would allow you to hook up a 360 or 720 kilobyte external floppy drive here. Over here, we have the monitor connector. Now, this was a 13-pin connector, and it was generally used for connecting Atari-branded monitors to. It's a pretty typical RGB signal that comes out of here, so it can be fairly easily adapted to other kinds of monitors. This handles 320 by 200 in 16 colors, or 640 by 200 in 4 colors out of a palette of 512 colors. It can also handle a resolution of 640 by 400 in monochrome, which was a really nice high-resolution display that was actually a higher resolution than the Macintosh of the day could output. You needed a special monitor to get that mode and a special monitor cable to get that mode. Now, audio was also output out of pin 1 on the monitor connector, and you'll notice there is no other audio connector on here. I'll go over that in a few minutes on how we can add one. So if your monitor did not have speakers, you did not get audio out of your Atari. Here we have a nice on-off switch, we have a standard power supply connector, and very nicely a reset button for resetting the Atari. If this was an actual M series Atari, you would have a port here for the modulator for getting the video out to a standard television. Now here we have one of the highlights of the Atari ST line, which is a standard MIDI in and out port. That MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and it allows you to easily connect your Atari ST up to professional audio equipment like keyboards, drum machines, things like that, and then use the Atari to control that. So this became incredibly popular for musicians to use with their digital MIDI equipment. Now, other computers could easily handle MIDI, but because this had it built in, it automatically had an advantage. Lastly, we have the cartridge port here. Now this is a sad and underused little port. It could access 128K cartridges, so you could theoretically put a small game on there or something like that, but it wasn't used for very much. I can't find many references for cool hardware devices from back in the day that plugged into the cartridge port. If this could have handled memory expansion or an accelerator or a digitizer or some cool features like the expansions of other computers that existed at the same time, it could have made a lot of cool hardware available to the Atari. Now let's open it up and see what's inside. There's about 10 screws or so on the bottom that disconnect. Now I already have this unscrewed to make it easy. Once you get in, you see the keyboard right here. That just pulls right out, and then we have a little cable here, pops off to access the keyboard. Now you will notice that the mouse and the joystick ports are connected directly on the keyboard. So once you take the keyboard out, we've got no mouse and joystick ports. Next, we have an RF shield here. It's held on by several screws, and also these little twisty things here. We have to take a pair of pliers and adjust them a little bit to untwistify them. Now, in order to get this off, you need to remove the power supply. There are 4 screws on each side of the power supply, and a little nubbins here you have to take off. So you take off the 4 screws holding it on the motherboard, and then eventually the 50-watt power supply easily comes out of the machine with almost no effort at all. See how nice and simple? I'm gonna go get a crowbar. I'll be right back. Once the power supply is off, you can then take off the RF shield. Let's get this floppy out of the way too. That's just going to be in the way. Bye, floppy. Now I'm going to keep the RF shield in there. They're not as important as they used to be because we're not doing anything with radio frequencies, but it also seems to be a nice support for the keyboard, so I'm going to keep it on there. Now with the RF shield off, it reveals a nice, neat, and clean motherboard. I don't think this has been opened in 30-something years, probably 33 years or so, because all the little twisties were fully twisted on here. And it was fairly clean inside, although I have blown it out. Now along the bottom here, you're going to see your bank of RAM chips. On newer versions of the 1040, it uses higher density RAM chips, so you may have fewer RAM chips on your 1040. This happens to be a C070523-001 Rev C board. This does not seem to be one of the more popular boards. Most of them I've found are the Rev D boards online, and I'm thinking the Rev Ds probably have the C-Sync connected. That's one of the main differences. Now, over here we have our ROM chips. You notice there's 6 ROM chips. Each of them are 32 kilobytes in size, which adds up to 196 kilobytes of ROM. Now keep in mind that basically the entire operating system is stored on these ROM chips. The entire core of the OS is on the ROM chips. So they need to stay under 192 kilobytes, or in later generations, 256 kilobytes. Newer models of the STs had 2 ROM chips, each of them 128 kilobytes, giving you 256K ROMs. Now, there is a fairly straightforward mod available that will allow you to use just 2 ROM chips in even the older machines and give you the 256K ROMs. If I did that, I would be able to go up to at least version 2.06 of the Atari operating system, the TOS as it's called. but I think I'm just going to keep it at 6 chips, and I'll be able to go up to 1.04, which is a pretty stable version, and it's the last version that was really, truly, honestly designed for the ST line. Moving around to the right here, this is where the RF modulator would go if it was on this machine. Now you'll notice there's a couple headers here for a couple of resistors, and I think that's what I need to add to get C-Sync to work on here so I can use it with other kinds of displays like my Atari to SCART adapter. Under here we have Atari's video chip. It's in its own little RF shield there. That's what gives it its nice 512 color palette. Now over here, underneath the floppy cable, we have some glue logic chips, and we also have the Yamaha sound chip right here. Now, this is a fairly mediocre sound chip of the day. Some 8-bit computers used it, and it's okay. From what I understand, they were going to use a real very nice sound chip in there of their own design, but they ran out of time getting it to work, so they had to use something off the shelf. Then I think when they came out with the STE line a couple years later, they probably used their own audio chip, which was a much superior audio. But by then, everyone was already coding for these Yamahas, and they did not want to have 2 different versions, so they just kept coding for the yuckier Yamaha chip. Over here we've got a floppy controller which controls the floppy. It's 720K MS-DOS compatible, which is pretty nice. Here we have our beautiful 68,000 chip running at 8 megahertz. Now this is one of the things back in the day that Atari fans would use to say how much better their machine was than other competitors, because they ran at 8 megahertz and other competitors ran at 7.12 kilohertz. There are pros and cons to that. Now, I mentioned earlier there's no audio jack on the Atari ST, but it is incredibly easy to get an audio jack installed. Pin 1 on this monitor port, it should be that one right there, is what sends out the mono audio. So all we have to do is connect an audio jack. Some people use the 3.5 millimeter jacks. Some people use an RCA jack. You literally connect a wire right to here. You can solder it there. You can connect it there with an audio clip. Then solder another point someplace on the ground plane here to get grounding. Drill a little hole right here where you'd normally have your RF out right there, and mount your audio jack right there, and boom, in about 10 minutes you have an audio jack for your Atari ST. I think this is a mod that everybody probably has already done or should do to their Atari STs, and I'll be doing it very soon. Now, I have also read about a mod that you can do to the Yamaha chip where you grab onto some of these pins here on the Yamaha chip and give it actual stereo output. Now, I've got no particular reason to do that, and so I don't think I'm going to bother with it. I'm going to keep this one as pristine as I can. I'll certainly add things to it, but I don't think I'm going to mod this one very much. But you can do that if you want to. Now I'll get this fine machine put back together and make sure she still boots. Now, interesting thing, and it may be because mine has older 1.0 ROMs, if I boot it without a floppy in the drive, it takes about 20 seconds to boot, maybe 30 seconds to boot. It seems to be searching for a floppy. If I put any floppy whatsoever in there, even a blank one, the whole thing comes on in about 2 seconds flat. So this week, I really just wanted to present the hardware and a bit of history about the Atari ST. In my next Atari episode, I'll be going over some of the features of it, exactly what this thing can do, and I'll be giving it a proper review. And I promise you, it is not going to be a biased review. You all know that I hold absolutely no computer biases at all when it comes to retro computers. None at all. Now, I would like to thank my wonderful patrons on Patreon for supporting me, and you can too at patreon.com/10mark. And you can see the list of my wonderful patrons right there. As a perk, all of my $5 a month and up patrons are going to be soon receiving a poster that is printed from Amiga Art Contest 2019 that Pixel Vixen and I did last year. And you've seen a couple of my posters. There's one from Jojo073 right there. Thanks, Jojo. You did a great job. And I'll be sending these posters out in a couple of weeks. Speaking of the art contest, you may have heard that Vicky, Pixel Vixen, and I are now fully charging forward with Amiga Art Contest 2020. Hand-drawn pictures, mod files are new this year, 3D creations, ray tracings, animations, and photo editing. Please go to amigaartwork.com and take a look at how you can enter your own artwork into the competition. Thanks for taking the time to look at the Atari ST with me today. It's really not a bad system. I know I give some, gentle ribbing towards the Atari ST, but it's really not a bad system. Absolutely superior to the Macintosh of the day. Hands down, absolutely superior to many, many PCs of the day. Hands down. Please like and subscribe and comment below and tell me about your Atari ST experiences, or just call me an idiot for doing a show on the Atari ST. That's okay too, I don't mind. Don't forget, you don't want to hold on to these Atari Falcons. They're dangerous machines. Send them to me for proper recycling. Sure. And while you're at it, if you find one of the original Apple I machines up in your attic, total worthless garbage, ship those to me too. I'll take good care of them. But until next time, this is Doug. This is hard to say, from 10 Minute Atari Retro Cast, signing out.